All right. And so if we go to this SAQ right now, slide. Okay, there we go. So the first part of this question asks you to identify one way in which Christianity influenced the development of Islam during the 600 to 1200 CE time period. Okay, remember Christianity came first, so you're looking for how did Christianity influence Islam? And notice that's just an identify. You just have to tell me something there. The second two parts are both explain. Explain one key difference in the development of Islam and Christianity, and then explain one similarity in the spread of Christianity and Islam during this time period. Okay, so these are SAQ questions that you might see something like this. And so if we start for that first part, identify one way Christianity influenced Islam. Take a look at how simple your answers can be. You could simply state that both are monotheistic faiths, acknowledging Abraham's legacy. Both acknowledge the prophets Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. However, in Islam, Jesus is not considered divine. And both draw on the influences of the Old Testament. Any three of those answers would be acceptable, because notice all you have to do for these, okay, is you simply have to identify here. You don't have to explain. Okay, this is simply identification. So for a question like this, you could answer it in a single sentence. Now, if we go ahead to the next one, okay, which was explain a difference. Okay, take a look at.
Sir, I have a question. Sorry, is this recorded?
This is being recorded. Let me just check, but I believe I am recording this for later use. Hold on one second.
Okay, thank you.
Because I always record them, but let me just check. Yeah, we are recording. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
This
Sorry.
is posted later on. Okay. All right. So let's get back to where we were. Okay. So for the second question, okay, this was asking you to explain a difference between the development of Christianity and Islam. Okay, one very easy difference that you could identify for this is that the Christians were persecuted under the Romans, whereas the Muslims were not. Okay, and as a result of that, and this is where you would get the full point for this, because you are explaining, you would say that allowed Islam to flourish in the Arabian Peninsula and then beyond. So if you look at this first answer, the first part of it is simply identifying. Christians were not persecuted under the Romans until around, or were persecuted under the Romans until around 300 CE. Islam was not. That's an identification. What pushes it to the next level is explaining that this allowed Islam to flourish. Okay, which means to really thrive in the Arabian Peninsula. For the second one, okay, another possibility that you could have had for this is saying Islam was a religious and a entity from the beginning. So it developed with both a religious and a political purpose. Now, what you would need to do for this is explain that when Christianity developed, it was not political, it was only religious, okay? And I kind of explained that in the next part of here. Christianity developed separately from its political authority, okay? Remember, Christians at the time did not control any part of the government, whereas the Muslims did, okay? Christian control of the government comes much later, okay? And then you would further explain that by saying that the caliphs were both religious and political leaders, okay? So all of those things collectively would push that answer into acceptable territory. So you could either use that first one, or you could combine these other three bullet points here into a single answer. All right, and then for the last part of this question, here we go. Okay, and then for the last part of the question, explain a similarity in the spread of Christianity and Islam. Okay, you could talk about how they were both spread via the use of trade routes. Okay, so merchants and trade was going to be very important in the spread of these religions. Okay, so you could talk about the trans-Saharan trade if you wanted to. You could talk about the Roman roads for Christianity and then use trans-Saharan trade for Islam, okay? You also could talk about a similarity being that they both appealed to the lower classes. They both appealed to the poorer classes, the poorer groups of people who were looking for something to believe in. Remember that the Muslims, the early Muslims, they were very, if you recall, they were very upset with the state of the world at the time, okay? They believed that there was a huge disparity between the rich and the poor. And so they were looking for something to believe in that gave them purpose. Whereas with Christianity, when it first starts to spread, the earliest Christians were all persecuted by the Romans, okay? And so they were again looking for something that would make their lives better, okay? And then you could talk about how eventually they both became supported by the government, okay? Eventually the Romans adopt Christianity thanks to Emperor Constantine in 325. Okay, and then Islam, of course, becomes entwined with the government fairly early on as well. So any of those answers would work for that particular question. Okay, so keep in mind with your SAQs, including the one that you're working on this week for your assignment, that the answers don't necessarily need to be long, but they need to include important information. Your first answer, when you have an identify, that can be a single sentence. But whenever the prompt says to explain, that's going to need to be probably 2 to 3 sentences max, okay? So they should be short answers, they should be direct, but you do need to make sure that you're answering all of the questions that are asked of you, okay? Any questions about this before we move on to the real part of today's lesson? If you have a question, you can go ahead and unmute yourself while you ask it. Any questions? Okay. All right, so we're going to carry on then. This is what we're going to be looking at talking about today. We are talking about the development of Islam today, okay? And so we have 3 main objectives for today, okay? Explaining how the systems of belief and their practices affected society during this time period. So how did Islam affect society during this time period? What were the causes and the effects of the rise of Islam? And then what were the effects of some of the innovations of Islam? So that's really what we're looking at today. Those are going to be our 3 primary topics for today. And I want to first start by looking at this map with you, okay? And I know we've seen this map before, but this map shows the spread of Islam.
Hi, Anna.
What?
Thank you.
Okay. And
Huh? Okay.
whoever that is, mute your microphone.
Tres?
There we go. Thank you, Alejandro. Okay, so if you take a look at this map, notice that Islam starts right here in the Arabian Peninsula. We know that, okay? And then it fans out from there. And notice that it eventually, by way of Spain, and we'll talk about this later today, eventually makes it into Western Europe by way of Spain, okay? But you see that it goes both east and west into Asia and into Africa, and then north into Eastern Europe. At its height, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, but at its height, the Islamic Empire, okay, occupied more territory than the Roman Empire did at its height. So in terms of size, it is definitely one of the larger empires that we've spoken about, okay? And so a couple things, okay? You have to realize that this change happens very, very quickly. The Islamic Empire expands much more rapidly than do a lot of these other empires, okay? And they rather quickly, as you can see from that map, they rather quickly move out of the Arabian Peninsula and into the Western world. Okay, they move into what at one point was Egypt. Okay, they move into territory that used to be occupied by the Roman Empire. Okay, they move into Mesopotamia, into Persia, even as far east into India. Okay, and as the empire expands, of course, so does Islam as a religion, and so does the culture and the language of the empire. Okay, and so you're seeing Arabic as a language and also as a culture spreading rather rapidly as well too. Okay, and then one of the end results of this is that you see a lot of syncretism. Remember that syncretism is when you have different belief systems or different faiths kind of blending together. Okay, we've talked about syncretism, we've talked about voodoo being an example of syncretism. Okay, but basically Islam molds with or blends with a lot of these other cultures as it spreads. Okay, particularly in Africa. Not only Africa, but Africa in particular, you see a lot of syncretism happening there. Okay, so what ultimately happens here? Okay, what ultimately happens here is the spread begins to start in the latter half of the 7th century. Remember that the 7th century is the 600s, okay? And so it's in 644 when the old Persian Empire gets fully taken over by the Muslims. And then shortly after that, it's the Byzantines who are taken over by the Muslims. Now, remember that the Byzantine Empire is what was left of the old Roman Empire. Okay, the Roman Empire collapses or has already collapsed for the most part, and so Europe is essentially in the middle of the Dark Ages right now. And you had the Byzantines who were trying to consolidate a bit and trying to hold on to what was left. Okay, but they are ultimately conquered by the Muslims. At least in the southern half of their empire. Up north kind of holds on a bit longer, but the southern half of that empire is gone by the year 700s. And so the Muslims are then free to pretty much move through Africa, and they ultimately make its way into Spain. Okay, and so if you recall, Spain, even to this day, still has a large Muslim influence in it, because the Muslims occupy Spain for quite a long period of time. Okay, and they were hoping to use Spain as a way into Western Europe, but they don't get any further than that. Okay, they do try to work their way into southern France. But that is as far as they get. Okay, so the Muslim advance is stopped by the French army, and so Islam is not able to expand any further into Europe beyond Spain. Okay, and they're going to hold on to that Spanish territory until they are expelled from Spain in the 11th century. Now, as they work their way east, they're a little bit more successful. Okay, actually significantly more successful. Okay, and so in 751 they are able to move into what at the time was the Chinese Empire. Okay, and that also prevented China from moving further west. But really, their primary reason for all of that, okay, and really all of this, of course, is going to be trade. They wanted access to those very wealthy, to those very profitable agricultural areas. Okay, they wanted access to those products, and so if you look here, okay, when I mentioned the battle in France, if you take a look, okay, you can see, I know it's hard to tell, but the royal blue arrows, these arrows here represent the Muslim forces. Okay, whereas the red and the purple are the Chinese. Okay, and so this map kind of shows the Muslim movement into what at the time was China, okay, and just how far east the Arab army was able to get. Okay, so now that we know what kind of territory they have occupied, okay, what we need to understand now is, how did the Muslims come to build such an empire? Okay, and it's through a couple of different things. I think the main thing, though, and the one that I want to focus on right now, one of the main ideas here is that they were incredibly tolerant of other beliefs, and we've talked about this before. Okay, they did not try to convert Christians. They did not try to convert the Jews. In fact, not only were they extremely tolerant of them, okay, but they were completely okay with those faiths for a couple of reasons. One, they were monotheistic, okay? Two, a lot of Christian practices, a lot of Jewish practices, and a lot of Muslim practices are very, very similar. Okay, they all engage in prayer. They all engage in fasting during certain times of year. They all make pilgrimages. They all believe in certain prophets. Okay, and so because of this idea that they were what they called people of the book, meaning that they all followed the Old Testament, they were able to practice their own faith freely, provided, of course, that they paid a tax. Okay, so if you wanted to practice your own faith and you lived inside of the Muslim empire, all you had to do was pay a tax. If you didn't want to pay the tax, then you simply converted to Islam. Okay, most people were okay with paying that tax. Okay, and in fact, if you were considered a person of the book, meaning if you were a Christian or a Jew or, of course, a Muslim, you could serve in very high government positions. So there wasn't the level of discrimination here that you're going to see later on in world history in Western Europe when the Christians assume control of much of Western Europe. Okay, there is a distinct amount of religious toleration happening here, even religious freedom, if you want to call it that. Okay, and so our third group to control the Muslim empire. Okay, basically, the way that the Muslim empire is set up is every time someone new assumes control, you have what's called a new caliph, okay, or a new caliphate. And so the Abbasid Empire is the third one, okay? Remember, Muhammad, of course, is the first one, okay? So the Abbasid Empire becomes the third one. Now, they are the ones who move the Muslim capital to Baghdad, of course, which is in modern-day Iraq. Okay, so they move the capital into Baghdad, and they make Baghdad really a center of any kind of science at the time, technology. Okay, basically, Baghdad becomes this ultra-modern, extremely intellectual city where the world's best scientists, where the world's, just smartest minds are coming to gather. Okay, remember that at this time, it is the Muslims who were the best scientists in the entire world. Okay, keep in mind, Europe is still in the middle of the Dark Ages. Okay, European scientists, probably by and large at this point, many of them still believed that the Earth was flat. Okay, and so in terms of science and in terms of technology and things like astronomy, okay, and even non-science areas, even things like writing, culture, the arts, all of those things, okay, Baghdad becomes the center for all of those things. So think of Baghdad kind of as the New York City of that time period. Okay, and then ultimately, unfortunately, by the way, it's a fairly short reign for Baghdad as being such an important city, because in 1258, it is the Mongols who are going to destroy the city. Now, we know that it does get rebuilt, but it doesn't last particularly long, okay? All right, so there's another map for you. You can just see Baghdad, as I said, is in modern-day Iraq, and it is in the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, okay? All right, so our next group of people who control the Muslim empire, our next group of people that assume control is the Delhi Sultanate, okay? And this is basically a group of people, this is going to be now in India, as you would guess from the name, okay? And so this is the group that controls Islam down, or rather over in Central Asia, and comes as far as northern India, okay? And basically, this is where Islam and Hinduism are going to kind of clash for the first time, okay? And so what's going to happen is that, at least initially, okay, when this group moves into India, a lot of Buddhist temples are going to get destroyed. A lot of Hindu temples are going to get destroyed, okay? So that happens at least initially. When the Delhi Sultanate takes over in 1206, okay, this rule is going to become a little bit more established. it's going to become a little bit more structured, okay, and it's not going to be so so wild westy, if you will, okay. And what's going to happen is a significant number of these Muslim groups are going to move into India, okay. And who are they going to appeal to? Where they're going to appeal to those lower level Hindus. If you recall, Hinduism had this very, very rigid caste system that we've talked about before, which, remember, was this idea that even if you were born into a low caste, you were not going to move out of that caste. You were kind of stuck there, okay? And that was just your place in life, and you should accept it, and that was it. You shouldn't fight. You shouldn't try to move up at all. You should just stay in that lower level caste. Okay, so as you can imagine, the people that were stuck in those lower levels, they actually thought, hey, Islam is not such a bad thing. Islam's talking about no more caste. They're talking about we can move up in the world, we can hold these official positions. We're going to give that a shot. And so when the Muslims moved into India, a lot of the people from those lower castes found it extremely attractive and were extremely willing to convert. Okay, and that was aided by these missionaries that came over, these Muslim missionaries who were called Sufi missionaries, who allowed certain Hindu things to kind of stay there. So they allowed certain local gods to still be a part of the faith, and they allowed the people to have these festivals. Basically, they developed a form of Islam that the Hindu people would find acceptable, okay? And that also aided in bringing in additional converts, okay? And so the missionaries, okay, really focused on the sort of mystical part of Islam, which was something that was extremely appealing to these former Hindus, okay? The Sufi missionaries wanted and preached about people having this sort of direct personal experience with the divine, whomever that happened to be. And so this is going to be the group of these missionaries who are going to be involved in the music and the dancing and the chanting, and they're using that as a way to become closer to Allah, okay? So it was not just about prayer, it was about using dance as a form of prayer, using music as a form of prayer. Okay, that's really what becomes extremely important to these missionaries and what allows them to really gain so many converts from those former Hindu groups. Okay. And they are the ones, as I mentioned, who had the greatest appeal at the time. Okay, they were the ones who would come behind the armies, and after the armies would kind of conquer a territory, they were the ones that would go in and would sort of calm everybody down and say, don't worry, this is not so bad, it's going to be all right. Okay, we're going to teach you a better way to live. And they were very, very much focused on, again, having a personal experience with the divine, okay, as opposed just to this sort of simply very rigid structure following laws, okay? So much so that some of the more devout Muslims actually have a great problem with the Sufi missionaries, okay, because they felt that they were deviating too much from traditional Islamic law, okay? And so as popular as it was, as popular as Islam was, it was never the dominant faith, okay, as it was within other parts of the world. So it never completely conquered India, okay? It never really took over the way that it did in the Middle East or took over the way that it did in North Africa. Even at its height, the Delhi Sultanate only controlled about 20 to 25% of the population. So the great majority of India remained primarily Hinduism, okay? And that is because, again, Islam is extremely monotheistic, whereas we know Hinduism has lots of different gods and goddesses, lots of different ways of representing, all of these gods and goddesses, okay? And that there were all these different ways to represent them, okay? And so as a result of that, Islam was never really absorbed and never really fully accepted by many of the Hindus, especially those in the upper classes. Okay? Now, the situation is somewhat different over in what now would become, or what is now modern day Turkey. Okay? What we would at the time consider the Byzantine Empire. Okay? The Seljuk Turks, okay, sometime between the 10th and the 14th century, they all convert to Islam. Okay, and this becomes our third major part of the Islamic Empire. Okay, obviously we have the Arab Empire and we had Persia. Okay, and now this group of people, okay, eventually it takes over after the Abbasid Caliphate declines. Okay, but they center their empire not down in Mecca, okay, but in what at the time was called Persia, what is now modern day Iraq. Okay, and this is the first time, this empire is the first one where we're going to see the term sultan being used to describe the ruler. Okay, and so this is, again, it's going to be a fundamental shift. You are going to see the heart of the empire moving out of Mecca into what is now modern day Baghdad. Okay, and so if you look at the map here, okay, you can kind of get an idea of how that empire spreads. Okay, and that they are again moving to the west. Okay, so if we want to talk now about some of the things that the Muslims achieved during their reign, okay, as sort of the most powerful empire in the world. Because the empire was so well connected, okay, and what I mean by that is that transportation was very good. Okay, the Muslims traveled both by caravan, okay, and then also by boat. So because everything was so well connected, ideas moved about and circulated quite freely. Okay, and so you have these Muslim scientists sharing ideas with other people. Okay, you have these different texts. Okay, are all translated into Arabic. Okay, and so basically all of this is established and makes the Muslim Empire a preeminent scientific and scientific cultural center of the entire world, okay, of which is centered around a place called the House of Wisdom, which is in Baghdad. Now, the House of Wisdom, just really briefly, okay, this is going to be sort of like this cultural center that is established as a place where these scientists and these scholars can go and can share ideas and can kind of discuss ideas, discuss philosophy and whatnot. Think of it kind of like a university type setting where these people can go and can share different ideas. Okay, and so places like the House of Wisdom lead us into the golden age of Islam. Okay, where we have this movement where the works of the ancient Greeks begin to get translated into Latin. So some of those very important Greek philosophers like Aristotle, okay, Aristotle's works are now translated into Latin. Okay, this makes it obviously very much available to the Arab world. Now, the goal of this project was to take as many of those classic texts as possible, okay, and to translate them from Greek into Arab so that these Arab scholars could have access to and could study the works of the ancient Greeks, okay? And it was not only philosophy. They wanted scientific texts, particularly astronomy. They also wanted medical texts. They wanted all of those things transferred into Arabic from their original Greek text, okay? And so as I mentioned earlier, the House of Wisdom is this sort of academic intellectual center for people who wanted to study these ancient Greek texts, okay? And so they argued that it was reason, not revelation, that was the way to truth. That, by the way, is something that you're going to hear again during the Renaissance, okay? So it's something that the Europeans don't start to talk about for another 600 years or so, 700 years or so. Okay, but it's something that the Arabs talk about, much sooner. Okay, now eventually the House of Wisdom becomes, I don't want to say it goes out of style, but sort of it kind of clashes with traditional Islam. Okay, and so you have this more conservative, more traditional group of Muslims who don't want that line of thinking. They don't believe in reason. Okay, they only believe in what's explicitly stated in the Quran. The same way that you have a group of Christians later on in world history who don't follow a lot of science, okay, and who only believe in things that are explicitly stated in the Bible. Okay, so you do have this sort of more conservative, more extreme group of Muslims as well, similar to, again, fundamentalist Christians. Okay, now in terms of the intellect and in terms of things that you're going to see in terms of Muslim achievements, okay, you are going to see it is Arab scholars, for those of you that don't like math, it is Arab scholars who develop algebra as a way to sort of model and to expand mathematics. Okay, they are going to build upon traditional Greek medicine and traditional Indian medicine to come up with new practices in both the medical field and in pharmacy. Okay, and it is Arab physicians who, for the very first time, diagnose diseases, things like measles and hay fever and smallpox and rabies and diabetes. Okay, all of those things are diseases that are first identified and first diagnosed by these Arab scholars, by the Muslims. Okay, they also discover cataracts. They discover how to operate and how to fix a hernia. Okay, they are the first group of people who realize that you can fill teeth that have cavities with gold. Something that
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Karina.
Okay, so like, how come it was these specific people that knew all this stuff? Like, was it where they lived, or did they just work together and no one else did?
It was both of those things. It was where they lived. It was the fact that they had access to these texts. Okay, so they were building on the ideas of the Greeks. They were, once these texts had been translated into Arab, they were able to read them. They were able to see the ideas of the Greeks and kind of build on them and kind of study them. Okay, so it was sort of just like a continuation of work that was done by a previous group. Okay, they were able to build on those ideas.
Thank
Does that
you.
make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and so all of these discoveries make their way into Western Europe, eventually, of course, because of Spain. Remember, again, as I mentioned earlier, it was the Muslims who had controlled Spain at the time. And so that's how these ideas get to Western Europe. Okay? And so this is just a piece of artwork that I wanted to share with you very, very briefly. You have a doctor here. This is in the 12th century, so this is in the 1100s. You have a doctor treating a wound, okay? Here you have a doctor working on someone's teeth, okay? And I don't think I had a date for this one. No, but this is a toothache that is being treated by this doctor here using cauterization. Okay, something that is still used today. Obviously, it's a much more sanitary version of it. And then interesting here too, they had discovered ways to use things like snakes. And so what they say here is they take a snake, they kill it, and it says the viper is skinned and dried to become a hair removal paste. If the viper's ashes are mixed with vinegar and smeared on the skin infection, it will cure it. Okay, so they had again discovered interesting remedies like this as a way to cure common ailments like a skin infection, which we would now call a rash. Okay, so like something that was very, very itchy. Okay, this is again how they used camels. Now this is probably going to gross some of you out. He who drinks its milk and its urine in the springtime will be cured of liver pain and of tumors of the liver and the navel. It also softens hardness of the spleen when drunk with mandrake milk and cures all ulcers that are washed in it. Okay, so if you're ever in any liver pain, maybe try drinking camel milk mixed with camel urine. Let me know how that works out for you. Okay. And so this chart here, I'm not going to go through each one by one, but these are just some important Muslim scientists with some of their achievements. Okay, and again, you don't have to memorize every single one of these. I just wanted to give you an idea that there are a lot of important achievements that come out of the Muslim empire. Okay, things that we still use today. Okay, I did want to highlight this one here at the bottom because of the achievements that they had specifically as it relates to astronomy. Okay, and so
Oops, sorry.
Go ahead. No? Okay. And so Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, he becomes one of the most prominent Arab astronomers at the time. Okay, he writes approximately 165 books about astronomy. Okay, and he is going to provide Copernicus much later with a lot of inspiration for his astronomical models. Remember that it is Copernicus much later on who posits the theory that the sun, not the earth, is the center of the universe. And Copernicus was very much inspired by the works of Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. Okay, so he's sort of, again, just this sort of precursor to the achievement of Nicholas Copernicus. And so Copernicus gets all the credit for this, but it's actually this Muslim scientist who has done most of the legwork. Okay, and that again brings me to a graphic that I showed you Monday too. Okay, and so yesterday, or rather Monday, we talked about a lot of the inventions of the Chinese. Now we add, if you look to the left, we add a lot of the discoveries and the inventions of the Muslims. Okay, all of these things collectively allowed the Renaissance to happen within Europe. And so without the works of the Chinese, without the works of the Muslims, all of the discoveries and things that the Europeans come to find during the Renaissance, none of those things would have happened. And of course, it is the Europeans who get all of the credit for these things, again, despite the fact you know, that they owe most of these discoveries to things that the Muslims and then the Chinese have already done. Okay, and of course, once again, it is Spain that allows many of these ideas, many of these inventions, many of these new technologies to eventually work their way into Western Europe. Okay, so it is Spain that does that. Okay. And so just coming back to this earlier graphic, okay, with just a little bit added on to it over here, you can see that all of that scientific knowledge, all that medical knowledge, all of that philosophical knowledge that ultimately becomes a major part of European culture during the Renaissance, that all arrives in Europe by way of the Muslims, okay? That all comes from the Muslims traveling through Spain. Okay, so that is how a lot of this culture makes its way into Western Europe. Okay, and so I want to stop here. Okay, actually, that is the end, and I want to stop here. And if anybody has any questions right now, I'll go ahead and answer them before we wrap this up. So if you have any questions, go ahead, unmute yourself, and you can go ahead and ask them now. Darlene, you have a question. Go ahead. Take yourself off mute, and you can ask away. I'm trying to unmute you myself, but it's not letting me. So go ahead, Darlene. You've got to take your mic off mute, and then you can ask.
I was just wondering if you could like go over the homework just to see how like we're supposed to answer it.
Sure. All right, so let me go back to that. Let me pull the homework assignment up for you in Teams. Let's see.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, you guys can't see my screen at the moment, right? No. Okay. All right. So let me share the screen with you. Uh, there we go. Okay. So if you go into the assignments, okay, you'll see that there are two of them posted. The first one, okay, there are two things posted. So I would do this one first. It's kind of interesting to me that many of you started with the second assignment. Okay, I guess it doesn't matter. But I would do this particular assignment first. And so this is what it should look like for you. There is a reading about developments in Southeast Asia, and then there is a set of notes that you have to complete. Okay, and so once you download this assignment, remember to click the three little dots to the right of the assignment. Let me switch back to student view so I can see what you see. Okay, if you click the three little dots here, make sure you choose Open in Word online. If you don't choose that, it's not going to let you edit it. I know a couple people sent me messages yesterday that said there was no way for them to type inside of the document. You have to choose Open in Word online, and then it'll open up a new tab. Okay, so it'll open up a new tab here. It's going to make me sign in. Hope this goes quickly. Okay, so once I get signed in, here we go. It's then going to pull up the actual assignment. Okay, and so now you'll see I can type, I can edit, I can do all of those things. Okay, and so what you'll want to do, you're just going to type right in the boxes. Okay, there are questions on the left-hand side that you need to answer based on that reading that I gave you. So for this one, you're simply using the reading to answer those questions, okay? And you can type just right in the boxes. Now, for this second part of this, you're going to explain to me how China influenced Korea, both in a positive way and in a negative way, okay? And then you're going to do the same thing for Japan, and then finally for Vietnam. And then on the right-hand side, okay, there are three short questions that you have to answer. These questions can be answered just with bullet points. You don't need complete sentences or anything. And then here's the great thing about this. This is going to auto-save for you. So when you're done, you simply close out of the window and it's auto-saved for you, okay? You don't have to worry about uploading anything. It'll already show as being completed and being submitted on my end. So there's nothing additional that you have to do there. So that's the first assignment. Let me show you the second assignment. Okay, and the second one is the SAQ practice. And so for this one, when you click on it, okay, again, it's going to look like this to you. Now for the SAQ, okay, I recommend you set a timer for 45 minutes and you don't spend more than 45 minutes on it. Use your notes, use your, your textbook, use whatever, but only give yourself 45 minutes to type this out. Okay, because we're thinking, that your AP exam is probably going to be SAQs. So this is good practice right now for you to start knowing that you can use your notes on the AP exam now. You can use your book, but you're still timed to only 45 minutes. So you need to make sure that you're making the best use of that 45 minutes. And so again, if you open it in Word Online, it'll open up a tab. It'll open up a browser window for it. And again, it's the same thing. Okay, you're simply going to type your responses right underneath each part of the prompt. So there's a brief quote here. Okay, and then there are three different questions related to that. And you can just, go right in here and you can just type your answer right in that spot. And just like with the other one, it's going to auto save it for you. Okay, and again, notice we have identify, explain, explain, which means this first one, part A, should be a sentence. Parts B and C should be about two to three sentences each. okay? Because you are explaining there as opposed to simply identifying, okay? Does that answer your question, Darlene? I guess so. Okay,
Thank you.
you're welcome. All right, any other questions?
Can you tell us the textbook pages for the SAQ, like through Teams? It doesn't have to be now.
Yeah, because I will look it up and I'll post it on the Teams page. And I will let you know where in your textbook you'll want to look, okay? Go ahead, Chloe.
For the SAQ, do we have to cite evidence since you gave us like a document thing? Do we just type out an answer?
Well, you should type out an answer. In terms of citing evidence, it's either going to come from something that you've read or something that you found in your notes. You do need evidence, you know, but it's not going to be like you're not quoting documents or anything. Okay, it should be just things that you know. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right, so I will have office hours from 1:30 until 4. I have to go teach regular now. So after that is over and I grab something to eat, I'll be logged into Teams from 1:30 until 4. I will post the video of this lesson at that time. I will also put the textbook pages up for that SAQ, so you can take a look at those, and then I'll be available to answer any other questions. Okay, so does anybody have anything else really quickly before we end this call?
Can we sing a song?
You can sing a song if you want.
I want to sing a song instead. Can I sing a song?
Sure, go ahead and sing.
But what song?
I don't know.
You Renegade.
I don't know how that. I don't know that song. I don't know it.
The box.
Don't Stop Believing. I've got a request in the chat.
No,
Don't
sing the
stop.
box.
Somebody wants to sing something from The Lion King.
Eh,
The circle of life.
All right,
Say
Brown skin girl.
her skin just like pearl.
All right, well, we're going to go ahead and end this meeting now before the singing ruins it for everybody. So I hope
Ruin what?
I'll be around beginning at 1:30 for my office hours.
Oh my God, is that raining?
Friday morning. Have a great day, everybody.
Concern me.